The history of slavery often focuses on the transatlantic slave trade, in which millions of Africans were forcibly transported to the Americas. However, the history of slavery is far more complex and diverse, encompassing a variety of peoples, regions, and periods. One of the most overlooked aspects of this history is the white slave trade, which has been largely forgotten, ignored, or minimized in the broader narratives of slavery. This particular form of enslavement spans across different eras, from ancient civilizations to medieval and early modern times, involving Europeans who were captured, traded, and sold into servitude. Understanding the white slave trade challenges conventional views of slavery and exposes the intricate global systems of exploitation that have existed throughout human history. White slavery was not a singular phenomenon, but occurred in multiple forms across centuries. In the ancient world, Greeks and Romans captured and enslaved people from the northern territories of Europe, including the Celts, Germans, Slavs, and other groups. These people were often taken during military campaigns or raids and were sold into domestic servitude, agricultural labor, or used as entertainers and concubines. In Roman society, the enslavement of non-Romans, particularly those from Northern Europe, was common, with slaves playing a significant role in the economic and social fabric of the empire. During the early Middle Ages, another significant phase of white slavery occurred with the rise of the Islamic world. After the Muslim conquest in the 7th century, Arab and Berber traders became deeply involved in the slave trade, and this network extended into Europe. Slavic people, who lived in the regions that encompass modern-day Eastern Europe, were often targets of these raids. The word slave itself is derived from Slav, reflecting the prevalence of their capture and trade in the Muslim world. The Slavic people were taken to the Islamic caliphates, where they were forced into various forms of servitude, including domestic labor, military service, and concubinage. One of the largest forgotten episodes of white slavery was the Barbary slave trade, which took place along the coasts of North Africa from the 16th to the 19th centuries. The Barbary pirates, operating from the ports of Algiers, Tunis, and Tripoli, captured thousands of Europeans during raids on ships and coastal towns across the Mediterranean and even as far as Iceland and the British Isles. These pirates, often acting under the authority of the Ottoman Empire, were a formidable force in the Mediterranean, using European slaves as a vital part of their economy. Men were frequently put to work in shipyards, quarries, or galleys, while women were often sold into harems or domestic servitude. Some estimates suggest that between 1 and 1.25 million Europeans were enslaved by Barbary pirates during this period, a staggering number often omitted from mainstream historical narratives. The Barbary slave trade had a profound impact on European coastal towns. The fear of being captured by pirates led to the abandonment of entire villages, and many regions fortified their coasts in a desperate attempt to ward off raids. While Christian European states and the Barbary states engaged in a series of conflicts and negotiations to free captives, the trade persisted for centuries, fueled by the lucrative demand for slaves in North Africa and the Ottoman Empire. Another largely forgotten aspect of white slavery involved the Ottoman Empire's capture of European Christians, particularly during the expansion of the empire into the Balkans and Eastern Europe. In the Ottoman practice of devshirme, Christian boys from conquered territories were forcibly taken from their families, converted to Islam, and trained as soldiers or administrators. These boys, often called janissaries, formed the elite military corps of the Ottoman Empire, serving the Sultan with fierce loyalty. While they were not slaves in the traditional sense of chattel slavery, their recruitment was coercive, and they were permanently separated from their families. Moreover, women from European territories were also taken by the Ottomans, where they were sold into domestic servitude or harems. In Russia, a form of white slavery emerged during the 16th and 17th centuries as the Russian state expanded into Siberia and Central Asia. Indigenous peoples, as well as captured prisoners of war, were often forced into servitude, and some Slavic Russians also found themselves enslaved. In some cases, these individuals were sold to Central Asian traders, continuing the legacy of slave trading that had existed for centuries along the Silk Road. The Russian economy relied heavily on serfdom during this period, which, while not technically slavery, shared many characteristics with it, particularly the lack of personal freedom and the harsh conditions under which many serfs lived. The Atlantic world also witnessed episodes of white servitude, particularly through the system of indentured servitude that developed during the colonization of the Americas. While not technically slavery, indentured servants were often treated similarly to slaves, working in harsh conditions for a set number of years in exchange for passage to the New World. Many of these servants were poor Europeans from England, Ireland, Scotland, and Germany, who were lured by promises of land or opportunity. However, the reality was often far grimmer, with many dying from disease, overwork, or abuse before their terms of servitude were completed. Some were also subjected to outright slavery, particularly in the early colonies where the lines between servitude and slavery were blurred. Children born to indentured servants were often bound into servitude themselves, perpetuating cycles of exploitation. In addition to indentured servitude, there were cases of outright white slavery in the Americas, though they were rare compared to the overwhelming numbers of African slaves. The British Empire, for example, forcibly transported thousands of Irish and Scottish prisoners of war, convicts, and political dissidents to the Caribbean and American colonies. Many of these individuals were sentenced to work on plantations in brutal conditions that were indistinguishable from those endured by African slaves. While the racial dynamics of slavery ensured that Africans would remain the primary target of the transatlantic slave trade, these forgotten episodes of white slavery reveal the broader systems of exploitation that characterized the colonial world. The history of white slavery disrupts the common narrative that slavery was solely a racialized institution in which only non-Europeans were enslaved. In reality, slavery has been a global institution that transcended racial and ethnic lines, driven by the demand for labor, the spoils of war, and the expansion of empires. Whether in the Roman Empire, the Islamic Caliphate, the Ottoman Empire, or the early modern Atlantic world, Europeans were both the perpetrators and victims of slavery. The reasons why white slavery has been largely forgotten are manifold. One major factor is the racialized nature of modern slavery, particularly the Atlantic slave trade, which indelibly linked slavery with African people. This association, deeply embedded in the cultural and social consciousness of the Western world, has overshadowed other forms of slavery, including those that affected Europeans. Furthermore, the end of white slavery in the Islamic world and the decline of the Barbary pirates coincided with the rise of European imperialism, which created a sense of superiority among Europeans and an eagerness to distance themselves from their own histories of enslavement. Additionally, the legacy of African slavery has rightfully demanded the attention of historians and the public, given the immense suffering and long-term consequences it inflicted upon African descendants. However, this focus has often come at the expense of a more nuanced understanding of slavery as a global institution. The omission of white slavery from mainstream historical narratives reinforces the notion that slavery was a uniquely African experience, rather than a universal system of exploitation that affected many peoples throughout history. In conclusion, the white slave trade, although largely forgotten, was a significant part of global history. From the ancient enslavement of Europeans by Greeks, Romans, and Muslims to the Barbary slave trade and the Ottoman capture of Christian boys, white slavery existed for centuries across various regions and empires. Its erasure from popular history speaks to the complexities of slavery as an institution and the ways in which historical memory is shaped by power, race, and politics. Understanding the full scope of slavery, including its impact on white Europeans, broadens our perspective on human exploitation and challenges simplistic, one-dimensional views of the past. This forgotten history of white slavery serves as a reminder of the pervasive nature of human suffering and the need for a comprehensive approach to studying the history of oppression.